Hey, I'm Brian with MPN. We're back here again in the garage studio with the Project X FX SVHO for another episode. Today, we are going to pull that jet pump completely apart and pull it out, rebuild the internals, replace the impeller. Let's get to it.
This season of Project X is brought to you by SBT, the largest supplier of high-quality jet ski parts in the world.
So like we mentioned, in the last episode, we pulled off the reverse bucket and we disassembled the pump, the nozzle and the cone so we could replace our cables and access the linkage. If you were starting this from scratch, you can do this job with the ride plate still installed. We have it out because there's other work to be done. You would also be removing these rubber panels from the back side of the jet pump here. They've got little cutouts in here for the linkage and for the water flag hose. It's just two 10 millimeters, and I think that one is also a 10 mil. That one connects down to the ride plate right underneath the jet pump. So from here, I'm going to pull out the support bracket here. There's a couple of 12s and 14s. I'm going to disconnect the rest of the nozzle, get that off, and then we'll pull the mid section, the bearing area of this jet pump with the impeller in it out. So let's get to it. So we have our steering cable and our trim cable both connected to the nozzle. We need to get them both off. The trim cable is really easy. You just slide this collar back on the ball joint and it pops right off. The steering end is a little bit more complicated. It is held on by a 10 millimeter nut from below, and then we need to spin this stud out of here, and that's going to be easier done with this 5 millimeter Allen from above. That threads all the way through that aluminum cone. If you're lucky, it'll pop right off kind of just like that with maybe a hit with the palm. If you're unlucky and it's really, really caulked on there, you may have to use these pry points. Yamaha puts them in here. They put an ear here on the lower right and the top left. You can get a screwdriver in there and just gently pry this thing to break that seal and get her off. Now, I've got 4 more look to be 14 millimeter bolts, one on each corner. It's holding the intermediate housing, the impeller housing in the pump, and a surprise 10 millimeter here way on the left side. If you're not looking for it, you wouldn't know it was there. All right, there, ran it out, ran it back in, ran it back out. So if we were in trouble, we would see chunks of aluminum in the end of the threads here. So I must be fighting thread lock. There's a very good chance that it's just thread locking compound that I'm catching all this resistance from, which is good news. It means the rest of these can go faster. There we go. Piece of cake. Oh yeah, that one's, I can at least more clearly see that it's quite warm. I can see some, what looks like red or orange thread locking compound there right on the tip of the bolt. In a case like that, spraying penetrating oil, yes, it's good practice, but it's not really helping, not against thread lock. Oh, now, we should be ready to pull this housing down. I know we have some pry points. It looks like if I come in with a screwdriver right down here on the lower right corner, there's a gap in the housing. Same thing on the right. If you have the ride plate on, you can use a tool like a large 90-degree pick like this to kind of come in here above the ride plate, find a place to leverage against. But since I've got the ride plate off, I'm going straight in here with my flat blade screwdriver. Oh, there! I remember the goal here is very, very gentle pressure trying to pull the housing apart. And boy, I was not expecting as much of a fight as this thing gave me. So now we have, I'm going to split the other two halves of this apart on the workbench so I can see what I'm doing better. So right now we have the two rearmost sections of this pump housing and the drive shaft. So I'm going to be really careful not to bang that drive shaft against the other housing. Oh, and there it is. And that right there is what I was fighting. It's all of this RTV all the way around this perimeter. Oh, and it's around all the bolt holes too. And then there's a water passage here, which I believe is cooling water flow to the engine would be here. Yeah, because that's picked up by that little plastic screen inside there. Here we have our pump housing over on the workbench. It's time to crack these two halves of it apart. My goal here is, again, to use gentle pressure to spread these housings apart. The last thing that I want is to go hog wild on one of these and, one, break off one of these cast aluminum ears, or two, stretch this thing over and gouge the inside of the wear ring on the sides of the impeller. You can see just how tight and close it is here. We really want this to come off evenly to protect this impeller, especially if it's being reused. We are replacing it, but I'm still going to be careful. If you can avoid it, you don't necessarily want to put the screwdriver into that sealed area with the RTV. You want those surfaces to be able to mate up against each other and seal completely when you reassemble. Ah, there it goes. All right. Now we'll slide this wear ring carefully off of the end. And now we finally have our access to the impeller. We'll have to undo the cap off the end here. We'll pull the impeller off. We'll rebuild the internals here inside the bearing housing. Check to make sure the drive shaft is straight. Check to see if our wear ring is within specification. Looking at it, I have a feeling it is not. It's not gouged, but it's not smooth in here. But we will get out some, at least dial caliper, and have a look. Moving forward here, things can vary depending on what type of impeller you have on your ski. This is an aftermarket stainless steel unit from Solus. They use an end cap on here that is held in place with a few set screws. These are about 2 millimeter. If the 2 millimeter rounds off on you, a T8 Torx will slide in there. There are a few different things you can do to try and get a screw like this out. I'm a little worried they're corroded and going to be locked in place, kind of like those jet pump bolts. And with something this tiny, if I do strip out that head, it's really going to be a fight to get the thing back out again. You can take plastic, maybe from a bag or an air pillow, and wrap it around the socket to take up some of the air gap between the socket and the inside of the screw head. You can coat the end of the socket with valve lapping or valve grinding compound. It's got what I would describe as grit on it, and if it was to start to slip, that grit will start to grab onto the screw head around it and will help to keep it from slipping. We are going to start with the 2 millimeter Allen here and hope for the best, and if that doesn't work out, then I'm prepared for the worst. And these should not be very tight at all, and you don't have to completely remove them. They're just applying pressure against the drive shaft. Okay, that one came to 2 down. One to go. Piece cake. These are the sorts of things that are very easy to lose. And they're thread locked too. There's a tiny little bit of blue thread locker right there. Like Joe said, everything on this jet ski, every single bolt, fastener, nut, they're all thread locked. Sure seems like it. I don't believe that this is threaded on. I'm pretty sure this just slips into the front of the impeller. Just gently, carefully walking this thing out of here. There we go. All right, a little bit of twisting, and there she goes. All right, so now we have to set our pump housing up in a bench vise. We have a tool to hold the end of the drive shaft. We have to pull the cone off the end here so we can reach the other side, and we'll be able to remove the impeller, remove the drive shaft, and start to assess the condition of the bearings inside this housing. First impression, it doesn't feel, I don't feel any dragging, any grinding, any signs that a bearing is wiped out in any direction. These are all good signs. But we're still going to take the time to take this all apart, check it out, and rebuild. Well, thanks to the miracle of video editing, you're rejoining us slightly in the future. We ran into a snag or two trying to get this impeller off of the drive shaft. We had a soulless impeller removal tool. If it's a stock impeller, like this cast aluminum unit right here, they cast the hex directly on the end of the snout, so it's real nice and easy to get with a big wrench. But the soulless and some of the other aftermarket impellers, they require this counterhold tool, which is supposed to slide into the front of this impeller and grab matching teeth inside, right, with these little guys sticking off of here. The problem is we had the wrong size. It does slide over the drive shaft. It does not slide into the impeller. Now herein lied a real challenge because it's peak boat season right now. There's no available appointments at any marinas or shops in the area. Believe me, we checked. After some searching and a whole lot of phone calls, we did finally make a new friend, Dan at Adrenaline Racing, located in Chardon, Ohio. It's about an hour away from us. He had some availability. He was kind enough to let us come in the next day, and he had the tools that we needed, and he was able to crack this impeller loose for us. Now, I can give you a quick run through of what we had to do. I wasn't able to film. We use a counterhold tool that slides onto the splined end of the drive shaft. That goes into a bench vise, and then that counterhold tool slides into the front of the impeller. We had to heat the impeller to break free some of that thread locker that was inside, and then with a giant crescent wrench and 3 sets of hands, we were able to grab that tool and crack this thing loose. Now, these impellers are reverse threaded. They are left-hand threaded, so you have to turn them, if you're facing the front of the impeller, you have to turn it clockwise to unscrew it. So now we are out of our pickle, thanks to Dan. So our impeller is off. I'm going to take this thing back out of the bench vise. These threads are longer than I expected. There we go. So our soulless impeller did serve us very well, but it is out of its service life and will be replaced. I'm going to bring the press over here, and we're going to start disassembly on the impeller housing. So we have just a few bearings and seals to contend with, and we will be right back with that. Simple place to start here is going to be our water inlet. Really, we could leave this on for right now, but I want to get it off. I want to see what condition this thing is in, and I also want to protect this thing as I'm slinging this jet pump around and trying to disassemble it. So just a couple of 10mm bolts here that hold the inlet into place. Now this water inlet, this is one of those really critical areas of the jet ski. Number one, you want this to be sealed and functioning properly. You also need to make sure that the inlet port here is clear. One of those things to keep an eye on as you're in here and working. The cap comes off first. You'll notice there's an O-ring in here. That's the first layer of seal, and it is, not surprisingly, almost completely flattened out. As these O-rings start to wear, they go from being very, very round and providing a nice seal, and they start to flatten out over time. The thing to look for with these O-ring seals, when they start out their life, they're very, very round and they provide a nice seal against both surfaces. Ones that are older like this is started to flatten out, and this will not be able to apply the same sort of pressure and seal against the two surfaces as it could when it was brand new. This is going to be replaced with our rebuild. Now we've got the inlet strainer, which is plastic from the feel of it and could be quite fragile. But the strainer is clear and there's no chunks missing. Both of the inlet baskets here are clear as well. And here, this time the O-ring stayed on the aluminum and came out of the plastic. This typically will stay in that recess on the back side of the strainer basket here. And so everything is looking good in here. Now let's move on to the cone. That is a 5mm Allen. Things to look out for here, we are looking for any signs of water intrusion. We will see the ends of the bearing. We will see the grease inside this when we crack this guy loose. And yeah, we're going to be looking for any signs of water dripping out, or say milkshake, the look that grease or oil gets when it's been contaminated by water or moisture. So I see, yep, okay, I see two very, very clear pry points. Just like with the jet pump, this is gentle pressure. We don't need to go hog wild here. There should be just a couple of O-rings around the, there we go. All right, so here's our bearing grease. And it's discolored. It's a little dark, but I am not seeing any signs of moisture, milkshake, any of that sort. So now it's time to remove this nut and washer and get ready to pull the drive shaft out of the impeller housing. So to do that, we need to flip it back over, grab our counter hold tool from our friends at SBT, clamp that down into a bench vise, and then I need a 27mm wrench on this end to pull this nut loose. And apparently I need some more muscle. Oh, there we go. Now this is standard thread. This is right-hand thread. Nothing to worry about here. Counterclockwise, lefty-loosey. We'll pull it loose. The grease that's inside there is what's holding that washer on. It's just hydro-locked in place. There we go. Now we're finally ready for the press. We can push the drive shaft out of the housing, replace the bearings and seals, and get this guy ready to be sanded down and painted. We're gonna refinish the outside of this housing because this aluminum has seen better days. So let's get to it. All right, we have our handy dandy shop press all set up and we're ready to go. We've got the impeller housing now supported by the plates, and the jack is pushed right down to the drive shaft. If all goes well here, this thing should just push right out. You see, I've tempted fate there. Should not take a terrible amount of pressure. There we go. So there's two ball bearings inside this housing. The first one you can see as soon as you pull the cone off. That's the one we looked at. The other one is inside the housing, deep down inside the bore. That one cannot come out with the drive shaft because it's held in place by the casting. Here, there we go. About 2, maybe 3 inches of movement, and our drive shaft comes free. So now we have to set up a new jig, and we will grab a bearing puller and pull the bearing and then the seals out inside. As you can see, we've gotten a little creative with our fixture. Our next step is to remove this outer bearing from the housing. The manual shows this thing just sitting on the workbench and using a slide hammer. That's great if you have another set of hands, but at the moment I don't. So I have used a ratchet strap to just tighten this thing down against my 2x12 here, and I'm hoping that this is going to hold it in place while I try to slide out this bearing. So let's find out together. A little bit of propping here. Come on. There we go. There's our outer bearing. Now we've got to flip this back the other way. We'll remove the seals from the other end, and then we will press. There's the inner bearing, and then there's a sleeve that's also pressed in there. There's no way to grab that sleeve and pull it out. So we're going to press on the bearing from the other side, and we'll push the bearing and the sleeve out this direction all at the same time. Well, I had a bit of a surprise here. The shop manual really makes it sound like the spacer that's inside this housing needs to be pressed out with the bearing. But as soon as I flipped the thing over, the spacer slid right out. I don't know if I'm misreading that manual or if this could have possibly been the incorrect one. But in my case, this thing just slides right out, and there's a good, I don't know, 1/16 of an inch worth of space around it. Like it's not a tolerant, it's not a press fit by any means. Now on to the seals. I've got to do something a little bit different than the shop manual outlines here. The shop manual's talking about using a puller or a slide hammer to pull the seals out. With the way that these teeth are shaped, there's just no way for me to grab a good hold of that seal. So instead, I am using a trusty seal puller. If you're going to go this route, you just want to be really careful not to gouge into that aluminum as you're trying to pry the seal loose. I immediately have got some good movement here. Whoops, and I pulled looks like I pulled part of the second seal out with it. That is okay, because our friends at SBT have sent us, I got a case of the fumble fingers here. Our friends at SBT sent us the rebuild kit for this housing, so these seals don't have to come out in one piece. Not that they ever do. There we are. Yep, pulled out both seals at the same time. I wasn't happy about it, but now we're ready for the last step. And that last step is going to be to push inside this housing and press that final bearing out the other end. So for this final step, we need to go back to our handy shop press and use a socket to push this bearing from this end out this direction. Right? We don't want to damage the bearing, we don't want to damage the inside of the housing, so it's critical that we pick a socket that fits against the bearing but still has some wiggle room around it, so we don't want to get this guy stuck inside the bore. I may have done that once when I was much younger. So we're going to avoid that. We're going to grab, right now I've got a 27mm impact socket, and this is going to be our driving tool to push this bearing out of the housing. Now we got everything set up in our press, and now it should just be a matter of, there we go. I'm gonna leave my hand underneath it here for when that bearing pops free. There is a chance you might be able to get this done with a slide hammer like what we did with the other bearing. It depends on how long the fingers are on that slide hammer, but if you got access to a press, or if you can at this stage take it somewhere to have this part pressed out, it's worth the time just for the amount of effort that it saves. There we go. Now it's time to clean and inspect and get onto the rebuild. We're going to shift our focus over to the front end of the impeller housing and start with the oil seals. Your applications might vary. For our SVHO, for Big Blue here, we've got 3 oil seals. The inner two are both the same. These are relatively easy to install. I've got a 30 millimeter impact socket here. The key is to grab something to push the seal in with that will slide in and out of the housing and won't get stuck, and will apply pressure to the outside diameter of that seal. You don't want to push against the lip on the inside. This is what actually seals it, and if you put too small of a socket in there, you'll rip that straight out the other side. So for us, we're going to use a 30 mil to drive them in. We're probably going to use a bearing and seal driver. It's a long threaded rod with a pusher and a cup. That'll be the most gentle way of putting these in. Now, there is no need to grease the outside of these seals. These are press fit, tolerance fit into the aluminum housing. The complicated part comes on the third seal. This third seal the outermost seal has a much different style lip on the end here to seal up against a washer that is pressed onto the drive shaft. So these are a mated pair. If you're replacing these seals, you need to get this washer off the end of the drive shaft as well, which we will get to here soon. We need to apply pressure to the outer race or the outside of this seal so we don't damage it on the way in. Now, our 30 millimeter socket isn't going to work because that would push right up against that lip. That's what we don't want. So sometimes you have to improvise your own tools. There is a Yamaha tool for pushing this specific seal in, but it's very hard to find. So I took one of the old seals out of our that we removed and took it to the bench grinder, and I just ground away about 1 millimeter off the outside diameter here. Flip it around and it mates right up against that ring, and that will serve as our pushing tool. And this, just like the socket, will slide in and out of this housing, so I'll be able to pull it back out when I'm done. And with that, let's get this tool set up. I'm doing this by hand, and it's just scooching right in. Now the seal's nice and flush in there. I can switch back over to my socket and start driving it into the impeller housing. Now this one, along with the second seal, will go until they bottom out. There's going to be next to zero resistance here. We're not pressing metal into metal. Just sliding right in. Yep. And there, just I'm using one finger and applying pressure on here. It just snugged up. I'll run this back out again and give it a quick look. I have a feeling I'm fully seated now. Sure enough, yes we are. Now time for the second seal. And this again is one of those silver ones that doesn't have the big oil lip on it. That one seemed to slide in there a little nicer than the first one did. There, it's snugged up. Let's give it a quick peek and see how it looks. All right. So our first two seals are in here and sitting really nice. I'm going to take this opportunity to grab a little bit of that red marine grease off the workbench and grease the insides of these lips. Because right now they're easier to reach than they will be once I put the third seal in. And I'll do that again on the third seal. We definitely don't want these seals to go in dry the first time we go to fire this thing up. Now, on to our third seal. Like I said earlier, there are times where the OE tools are really, really nice and they'd be very good to have, and there are some times where the OE tools are just not feasible for a do-it-yourselfer or a small repair shop to get on their own. Those are the times where a little bit of creativity maybe just a hint of redneck engineering will really save the day. I'm being overly cautious since this is arguably the most important seal in this bunch. As remember, this is the snout, this is the front end of the impeller housing. So the impeller is going to be mounted right up here. All that force of the water coming through the jet pump is going to come right past this. And the last thing that we want is for water to be able to find its way past these seals and into the bearings. Now it's time to clean off my fingers again. Get some more fresh marine grease. Grease the inside of these seals. And with that done and out of the way, now it's time to shift focus over to the drive shaft. We need to grab that old ring or the washer off of there and push the new one on, and then we push the first bearing onto the drive shaft and press it all into the impeller housing all as one assembly. There's a definite theme today of improvising some tools and some creative solutions for the problems that we run into. This is exactly the kind of thing that you run into as a do-it-yourselfer or as a small shop. I don't have a good way to press this washer off of this drive shaft. I simply just don't have the Yamaha tools for it. I have a seal and bearing driver out of a toolkit we keep here in the garage. I have a 32 millimeter impact socket. It's my hope that I can give this thing a couple of whacks with the dead blow hammer and this thing will fling itself right off. If it is tighter on this drive shaft, then I'm hoping then we may have to come up with a different solution to maybe utilize the shop press. But I'm going to remain cautiously optimistic that with a couple of hits here, this thing is just going to work itself free. Ah! Or one hit. Very good. And with that, now it's time to find our bearing and press our new bearing onto the drive shaft. Quick overview here before we start. There are two different bearings that are on this drive shaft. So we got that washer popped off of here. We have two bearings. These cannot be mixed up. The OD of the drive shaft is, as you can see, much different down here on the front side compared to the back. These two bearings do not share the same ID. Same thing with the new bearings that you're putting in. One other important thing to note, the shop manual very clearly says that the lettering, the numbering, the etching, whatever you might see etched into the sides of the bearings here, those need to be on the front edge and the rear edge. That is how these things are designed to be installed. So I'm going to make sure that I get these in right side up. So with that out of the way, all I have to do is set up the drive shaft and get it ready to install the first bearing, and then we will install the drive shaft and the bearing and the spacer all as a complete assembly into this impeller housing. We're still improving some tools here. We've got the drive shaft set up on the press, and I think I've got it all sorted out so I can press this new bearing on. I want to review what I've done so far so you guys are still with me. I have the old bearing that I'm using as a sacrificial lamb that is slid onto the drive shaft and is resting up against this face right here. That is what's supporting the drive shaft as I press the bearing down on top of it. I've got our new bearing. I've got the laser etching facing downward, and I have to press this bearing starting here down onto this part of the drive shaft. There is a specification in the shop manual that calls out a distance from this face right here to the bottom of the bearing. On my application, it's 29 millimeters. That's where I've got to stop. Now, I am reusing the old drive shaft, so I can take it to where the witness marks are there from the old bearing, and I should be close, but I'm still going to measure it. On top of that, I have another bearing pusher that I'm using to grab the inside race of this ball bearing. Last thing I want right now is to push on the outer bearing. That would stress out that bearing. And then I've got a cap to sit on top. And in theory, this should be, I'm gonna tempt fate here, you ready? This should be an easy task. Now we're gonna stop a little short and check our height. I've brought it to just about where those witness marks are showing up, so I'm going to take my caliper here and I'm going to measure between these bearing races because that's our specification. And I'm at 33.7, so I have about 8 millimeters, which is what, just a touch over 1/4 of an inch to go. 29.01. It doesn't get much better than that. And with that, our front bearing is in place. With our bearing successfully installed on the drive shaft, it's time to clean our seal surface here on the front of the drive shaft and pack this bearing full of grease. Then we'll be able to press the drive shaft, the bearing, and the spacer all into the impeller housing as a single unit. And then we'll work on the bearing on the other side. I feel like I'm pulling out all the stops here with improvised tooling. We've got the spacer ready to go inside the impeller housing, and space is a little tight. I need to get grease in the inside diameter of this spacer and around the drive shaft. I can't get my fingers in there. So, if you've ever frosted a cake, you'll know what I did here. I shoved some grease inside a Ziploc bag. I'm gonna lop the corner off of here, and I'll just use this as a grease injector to fill that cavity inside. Okay, now quick clean up with a paper towel to get the excess grease off of there. We're ready to put this last bearing in. Now we've got our freshly packed bearing. I'm gonna move my etching so it's on the top. For this last part, all we need to do is drive against the outer race of this bearing and press it in until it bottoms out against that spacer that is inside the impeller housing. And see, now we're pressing against, we're sliding the inner race over the drive shaft and we're sliding the outer race inside the housing. So it is gonna offer up a bit more resistance. I'm spinning the drive shaft to make sure nothing is binding up. And there, I can feel through the handle. I'm all tightened up. So that bearing should be fully seated. It looks really good to my eyes. Yep, plenty of room. Now we clean the bolts, clean the threads, clean out the inside of the cap here, fill this with 20 grams, 0.7 ounces of grease, and we can reassemble this tail end, and then we will shift our focus over to the water pickup here on the side, clean the housing, and get it back in the jet ski. Since we're all done with the shop press, we've got everything moved back over to the bench vise again. I've cleaned out the threads inside the impeller housing as best I can. I cleaned the threads on the 4 screws for the cone, but we're not quite ready to put that on. We've got the flat washer and the 27mm nut here on the end of the drive shaft, and we need to torque this to 70 Newton meters or about 54.5 foot-pounds. Perfect. Next up, we put the cone on here. Off camera, I did clean out the threads inside the impeller housing and the threads on these bolts. And then I reapplied our thread sealant to help keep them clear of any contaminants until the next service. Of course, I'm holding this cone on because with all that grease inside and the O-ring, it's hydrolocking and it's trying to push itself back off on me. There does not appear to be a torque spec for these bolts. These are only M6s, so contact plus an eighth turn, i.e. just snug. We're finally nearing the end here. I've got our washer from the front side, I've got the new O-ring inside it, and I've got just a touch of grease in there to lubricate that O-ring as it goes. You want to make sure that that O-ring is fully seated into that channel. That channel is outside of the bore. You want to make sure that that O-ring isn't hanging outside of that because it could tear on its way over the drive shaft here. And for this part, a couple of taps with dead blow should be all I need to drive this washer down into position. No reason to go hog wild here. It's just meant to mate up against that front oil seal. And with that, we're ready for our water inlet. You may remember our strainer basket from earlier. We need to grab the O-ring out of the basket and out of the cap. These can be discarded. We replace them with the new seals from the rebuild kit. Now the basket goes in first. Cap goes on top. And reinstall bolts. And the last step here is to apply some more thread sealant to these bolts for the water basket. Now that we've got the cone on the back side and that spacer and O-ring installed on the front side, the bearings are now fully protected from outside contaminants. Now it's time to clean all of the sealant and the RTV that was on the outside of this impeller housing and get these surfaces ready to mate again once they get back onto, or once we install the jet pump back on the ski. And then we'll need to apply just a touch of grease to the threads here for the impeller. And I'm gonna have to go and get help because the torque spec on this impeller is 240 foot-pounds, and I am not confident I can get there by myself. We will find out together. And with that, we are finally wrapping up the impeller housing here on Project X. We've got the impeller housing rebuilt, we have the impeller installed and torqued down to specification. The strainer basket is on, and that has been rebuilt as well with new seals. We are good to go. Now we have some other plans for the wear ring, which goes over the impeller, that we will get to in a later episode, so stay tuned for that. At that time, we will show applying the new sealant onto either side of the housing and reassembling it onto the jet ski. But for today, this is a wrap, so we will see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.